Greetings. In this video, I want to briefly discuss the idea of anchoring plausibility to adjacent clarity when attempting to interpret a set of markings. And perhaps we could alternatively call this anchoring plausibility to contextual clarity. And this relates to a point I have been attempting to make for years in the discussions on attempts to interpret the markings on the pews in Savannah at the First African Baptist Church. You see, while others try to appeal to a larger historical or regional context, I've tried to appeal to a much more immediate textual context. For example, I've argued that if a marking resembles a character in some specific script or another, one should see how that might fit with other markings around it. As, for example, a circle, a simple circle, could be a cursive Hebrew samech, or it could be a Paleo-Hebrew ayin, or it could be a Ge'ez ayin, or it could be the Latin O, or it could even be the number 0, and so on, right? The surrounding markings help us clarify a particular marking, or a set of markings for that matter. And that doesn't just apply to apparent single characters, rather it could apply to proposed strings of characters as well. So I'd like to give a few examples, a few analogies to attempt to illustrate this idea. So in our first of 4 analogies, let's start with this. What do you think that is? What is that? Might that be an Arabic fa on the right, only in the maybe a Maghrebi, West African style, where the dot is below the character rather than above it? And, so if it is, perhaps that's an Arabic word, spelled fa zayin. If it is, perhaps that's an Arabic word. Maybe it's a verb in the imperative, like a bit of a slang word, but a verb in the imperative telling someone to get up. Maybe it's something like that. But what if I proposed that it's actually a Spanish word written in the Arabic script? What if I propose that more specifically, it's the word fiso, from the old verb facer, written again in the Arabic script, right? Might that seem like a leap? To be fair, it's really hard to say when looking at, this marking just in isolation like that. So let's now pull that back a bit and look at the marking together with its larger context, which is a context that's immediate and provided by other markings around it. And this is actually a page from Michael Cook's book, which was titled Koran, a very short introduction. And this is a bilingual rendering of the first verse of the 115th chapter of the Koran. And it was written towards the end of the 16th century. And the large text is the Arabic text of that verse, again, the first verse of chapter 105 of the Quran. While the smaller text is al-Hamiado, which is to say medieval Spanish written in the Arabic script. And for those who are interested, those who are curious, I'll put on the screen the smaller al-Hamiado text. I'll put it on there isolated with a transliteration into the Latin script underneath it, and then underneath that a clarification of what sort of Spanish sentence it was conveying, admittedly with 3 Arabic loanwords mixed in. And again, like I said a couple of times, this is a medieval Spanish translation of the first verse of the 105th chapter of the Quran. But moving on from that, let's try a different analogy. Consider this marking here. Now imagine we saw this somewhere and we're trying to determine what it is. And imagine someone proposed that it's actually a string of 4 Arabic characters, Mim, Ha, Mim, Dal, spelling the name Muhammad. And then imagine, aside from that, we saw this marking as well. And it was proposed that that's actually 6 Arabic characters, Alif, Lam, Ra, Ha, Mim, Nun, right? Spelling Ar-Rahman, the merciful one. Now, I imagine some might consider those proposals and say, maybe that's possible, maybe that's what it is, but it's really not clear. And then imagine it was clarified that we found these markings on a stone in Belarus. Perhaps that detail might make someone more skeptical, right? They might be like, Belarus, where they speak the Slavic languages, Belarusian and Russian. I'm not so sure these markings on a stone in Belarus are complex strings of Arabic characters, right? One would be within their rights to be skeptical. But now, once again, let's consider these markings together with their immediate surrounding context. And when you look at it together with the other markings on that stone, it becomes more clear that the upper marking is part of the basmala. It's part of a text that reads Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And as for that lower marking, it's part of the Shahada, and it's precisely the name Muhammad, right? This is actually from a gravestone in a graveyard of an old mosque in Belarus, and I'll share a link in the description to the video from which I took this image of this gravestone. Right? But with that, let's move on from that to yet another analogy really quickly. So looking at this, once again, the question is, what are these markings, right? And suppose it was claimed that these are actually 12 Arabic characters spelling out Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. Some might want to say, maybe, if it's sloppily written, but in an isolation, it's hard to reach any clear conclusion, and one is justified in being skeptical. But once again, if we pull back and consider the larger context, those markings are clearly part of yet another instance of the basmala, right? In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, however you want to translate that, right? And in all these examples, what is initially unclear finds clarification in adjacent markings, which are more clear. But let's consider one more example, a fourth analogy, in which what we're going to look at is far less clear than everything we've looked at previously. So what is this, right? This is actually a marking or multiple markings which were found on some material on a page which was from the Cairo Geniza. So a Jew in Egypt, in medieval Egypt, made these markings. Now, what if I told you that's the word Allah in Arabic? You'd be within your rights to be really skeptical, as you can hardly see anything there at all, much less a clear string of Arabic characters. But let me try to highlight it for you. So the dark blue highlights markings we can see, and the light blue fills in where I'm proposing that there used to be a visible mark that has since faded away. So with all this highlighting, it sort of looks like a sloppily written instance of the word Allah. But now let's remove those highlights. Do you see it? Do you see the word Allah? At this point, you'd be within your rights to not only be skeptical, but to think that a lot of imagination is going into interpreting these vague markings, especially when it comes to these attempts to try to fill in a blank, right? You'd be within your rights to not only be skeptical, but think that my imagination I've let my imagination run wild. I've let it get away, But once again, we can pull back and interpret that in light of the larger context. While it still might take a moment to make sense of this, one can arrive at the conclusion that this is actually yet another instance of the basmala, though a sloppily scribbled example of it. To the right of the portion that we initially looked at is a resemblance to ba sin mim, right? If the ba is unpointed and the sin is written just as sort of like a straight line, as is sometimes the case, and is often the case in handwritten Arabic. So that portion on the right plus the portion we initially looked at would be Bismillah, in the name of God. And that becomes more clear when looking at the markings on the left, which are more along the lines of Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, right? So the right half, which is very unclear, gains plausibility from the relative clarity of the left half. And that's all I really wanted to cover in this video. I wanted to convey the point that a proposed reading can seem really implausible in isolation, but it can gain plausibility from the relative clarity of adjacent markings. And I just wanted to have a quick video on this topic, which I can refer back to, as I suspect that this might come up multiple times in the future as more proposed readings may be coming out in the future, whether the near future or the distant future. And a desire to make this sort of video came to mind while I was looking at this photo of a pew at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. You see, someone had visited the church and posted this picture to Facebook. And, with all those dots, I started wondering what sort of reading, if any reading, might be proposed for this pew, especially if we tried to make room for the possibility that if this is intended as writing, the writer may have had a shaky command of that system of writing, and he may have had difficulty writing it, difficulty scratching it into the varnished wood, or if the board was already upright and vertical like that, inserted into the pew, the person who marked it, may have had difficulty trying to write from that sort of awkward angle. You imagine trying to turn from the side and write as the pew is vertical like that. However, if we can reorient this pew by rotating it 90 degrees and zooming in a bit on one side to even it all out, we might get a different perspective. And looking at it like this, I suppose one might feel like they see all sorts of things, at least all sorts of possibilities, especially with all those dots in mind. Like, for just one example, The middle portion might look like it has a sloppily written Ya Alif, Alif Ba Alif, which might spell out Ya Ba, O Father. But then that leaves us to ask, what about the rest of the markings to the left and the right of that proposal? What sort of phrase might employ the words Ya Ba? Well, as far as something clearly written, by something that was written by the firm and careful hand of a person who's well educated in writing Arabic, there's honestly not much there. But again, if we're imagining this was written by someone who only learned a little bit of Arabic and was trying to write something from a distant, decades-old memory, maybe something they learned when they were a child, and if we imagine they may have had trouble scratching it into the varnished wood or had trouble doing so from an awkward angle if the board was already vertical when they were marking it, and imagine that all of that caused the person to go off course, wildly and start and stop and write choppy, disconnected markings, If we make room for all of that, we might leap to something really wild and imaginative like this. And I'm guessing if any Shi'i friends might see this, they might at least smirk at this proposal. Now, as a disclaimer, I'm not actually proposing this. For those who are wondering, for those who don't know, this says Labaik Ya Aba Abdillah, which I guess would roughly translate to I support you, I stand with you, O father of Abdullah. This is a popular Shi'i slogan, and it invokes a name of Hussein, the son of Ali. But like I was saying, I wanted to say as a disclaimer, I'm not actually proposing this. The reality is that I think this sort of proposal strains credulity and does so more than the other Arabic proposals which have been made for the pews, right? I would say that skepticism is significantly more justified here than with the other proposals that have been made for the pews, and I think skepticism is justified there as well, but I think all the more so here, right? But I just wanted to use this as a soft analogy, right, as a thought experiment. See, the yellow text on the right would be really hard to take seriously in isolation, right? And so too would the purple and green text on the left, at least, again, if we're looking at this in isolation. Either case by itself, either end of the proposal would inspire one to quickly leap to saying, no way, But when one attempts to anchor the extremes or the edges to that middle portion, some might feel more inclined to shrug their shoulders and say, maybe, I don't know, it feels like a leap, but maybe. Now, of course, I realize this is a wild example, but I just wanted to offer it up as in such a proposed reading, what is very unclear on the ends might arguably gain a bit more plausibility or potential plausibility from the relatively, seemingly, potentially more clear portion in the middle, right? So, and that's where we get this idea of sort of gaining plausibility from adjacent clarity, right? Importing some of the plausibility of an adjacent set of markings. But, as I've already alluded to a couple times, this is also an example worth noting because there can be a lesson here about not letting our imaginations run wild. And I'm reminded here of a discussion I had with Orthodox Moor from a few years ago, in which it was noted that Suhaib Webb had looked at some images of the pews, and he seemed really reluctant to suggest anything for the markings. I'd say he was skeptical. And I mention this because Webb is the kind of guy who knows from experience that sometimes proposed Arabic readings can just be crazy, right? Suhaib Webb is the right age to remember that in the 90s, there were certain folks on the fledgling internet who were looking at, for example, the Coca-Cola logo, and they would look at it in the mirror, seeing the Coca-Cola logo reversed, and some of them were thinking that they might see insulting denials of Muhammad and the city of Mecca, Of course, it was a wild proposal, as, for example, the same A is treated as a mim dal in one place and an undotted ta marbuta in the other place, So again, it was crazy. But I mention that because my guess is that Suhaib Webb can remember that sort of craziness from decades past. And I would think that sort of experience, that sort of memory would make him a lot more sober-minded, a lot more careful when it comes to keeping one's imagination in check, and not getting too wild or too imaginative with what one proposes for potential Arabic text. But that's all I wanted to share for now. I just wanted to have a quick video as a reference which covers this idea in both directions, noting on the one hand that the possibility of transferring plausibility to something implausible from an adjacent marking, which is perhaps relatively more plausible. but also noting, on the other hand, the pitfalls of the human imagination attempting to fill in blanks based on familiar patterns, right? And again, I suspect this video's value is not as a standalone video, but more so in how I might be able to reference back to it in future discussions, as I honestly suspect that more proposed readings with varying degrees of plausibility may be on the horizon. So, I thought it might be helpful to try to establish a bit of methodological balance with a video like this, which looks in both directions. But whatever the case, as always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms, so feel free to share your thoughts, and God bless.